And sorry, and of course, yeah, and the course and requirement for translucency. The Chinese were the first to discover true porcelain well over 1,000 years ago, and for the last 500 years, these great porcelain rooms were constructed for displaying porcelain as a symbol of wealth, cultivation, and achievement. And now that royal association continues today, as we see the King of Pop immortalized in a hard-paste porcelain body here. Chinese porcelain may be the most successful export product in the history of the world. Witness the fact that both the Asian country and the porcelain share the same name, China. There's not much else can claim that. Now, at the very same time Chinese porcelain was gracing the halls and tables of the grand palaces, it was also used by the more common sort. We find broken Chinese porcelain in the early frontier settlements in America at Jamestown and many other North American sites. Shipping records tell us, and archaeology tells us, that later in the 18th century, nearly every household in colonial America used some form of this Chinese porcelain. And again, Chinese porcelain is a hard-paste product. Unlocking the secrets of making Chinese porcelain captivated the imagination of European potters. With royal assistance, European potters sought to duplicate the Chinese porcelain as early as the 16th century, but they were only partially successful, having to rely upon soft paste formulas to imitate the blue and white. This is where English Delft is such a big deal, because it's nowhere near the consistency of this paste, but it was an imitation of these highly valued hard paste Chinese things. The European discovery of true porcelain is generally credited to the alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger, working under the patronage or imprisonment of Augustus the Strong, if you know that story, in Saxony. This happens around 1708. This scientific discovery, in quotes, rocked the ceramic world, and other Europeans raced to duplicate Meyssen's achievements. So in the early 18th century, the Germans had discovered the secret of hard-paste porcelain. And suffice it to most of us that Meissen story is fairly well known, and their porcelain is still in production today. An earlier pursuit, which is rarely told, is the experimental work of London potter John Dwight. Dwight, he's often called the father of English pottery, took out this patent in 1672. Now this is 40 years before Meissen, to practice and enjoy the mystery and invention of making transparent earthenware, commonly known by the names of porcelain, china, or Persianware. So we had this scientific experimentation going on well before a lot of the other European countries, in England by John Dwight. And there is limited archaeological evidence from Dwight's factory. These examples suggest a porcelain-like body, but from what we know, based on this evidence, he was not able to create the hard-paste porcelain, but a pseudo-porcelain body. The point is, here is someone looking much, much earlier than most people give credit to. Now, we all know porcelain is just one type of ceramic body. But the porcelain requires the most specific materials and technology to be viable. Earthenware clay literally can be dug out of the ground almost anywhere, formed and fired in the kiln. Stoneware requires a better grade of clay and more care in the firing because it gets a much higher temperature. Porcelain, on the other hand, has to be mixed with a number of ingredients and fired at very, very high temperatures. You have to be a chemist first and a potter second, basically, to work or create a porcelain body. Throughout the world, the substance of clay has both religious, spiritual, and mythological importance. And no substance in the history of the world has more mystical properties than the kaolin clay. Kaolin is an essential magical substance. It has many crucial uses beyond making porcelain, from preventing diarrhea to performing voodoo rituals. Now, another story which is rarely told, it happens in 1767. Josiah Wedgwood, who we know well, sent an envoy from England to western North Carolina to investigate the Cherokee clay. And primarily, it was these mystical stories of the power of kaolin that piqued his curiosity. Now, these deposits clay are in the far western part of North Carolina, near the modern day Franklin. And in the mid to early 18th century, this truly was a rugged wilderness. It's hard to imagine any sort of Anglo-American settlement or journey into that part of the world at the time. It is still noted for its incredible diversity of geologic resources. It's known as the gem capital of the world, and it has seen centuries of various mining endeavors. And for thousands of years, this area has been the home of the Cherokee culture, who made use of these native clays for their pottery and other ritual uses. And one use was they used it to plaster the houses in this white lime. A commentator who had seen these homes in 1776 recorded that the Cherokee used these, but he also mentioned that some gentleman had been in the area hoping to create a design or to make china. And this is in 1776, so that's a reference we'll come back to. But someone has been to Franklin looking to create china from the kaolin deposits. But back to Josiah Wedgwood. In 67, he commissioned a Thomas Griffiths to sail to America and obtain a quantity of the Cherokee clay. Why did Wedgwood come to America to see kaolin? He really wasn't known for his interest in porcelain, but he was always interested in new materials that would further his business. And in his own words, he was interested in turning dirt into gold. Again, another reference to the porcelain gold connection. Commander of the colony is General James Oglethorpe, shown here. Now, Oglethorpe was forward-looking, and he was aware of Andrew's pottery business, and he encouraged Andrew to come to resettle to Savannah, Georgia, giving him both land and arranging funding because he saw that as a positive thing. So in 1738, Andrew moves there to set a pottery up. Now, much of what we know about Duchesne and Savannah comes from a series of letters recorded by William Stevens, who was the secretary to this board of trustees. And he records in 1738, Duchesne had already produced 2 kilns of handsome ware, pots, pans, bowls, cups, and jugs. The only archaeological evidence we have of Duchesne in Savannah are fragments of his salt glazed stonewares, and they appear to be on the same high level as his family was already producing in Philadelphia. Now, at this point, this is in the 1730s, Stevens also wrote that Duchesne had made a small teacup, of which, when he showed me, when held up against the light, was very near transparent. So this is not a stoneware or earthenware product. This suggests he's experimenting. He's doing something to create a porcelain body. Of course, this was big news, that Duchesne had ostensibly discovered the secret of the hard-paste porcelain making in Georgia. Now, Oglethorpe was excited to hear this. He reported back to his superiors in London that clay had been found here that a potter has baked into chinaware. So clearly they were aware of the importance of needing the right clay in order to create a porcelain body. Of course, the folks back in England were very excited, particularly the president of the trustees, the Earl of Egmont. Egmont passed on the information that Duchesne is the first man in Europe, Africa, or America that has found the true material and manner of making porcelain. And of course, that's a huge hyperbole in terms of course, Meissen had already been making hard-paste porcelain 30 years earlier, but this is how excited they were in England that the secrets to making hard-paste porcelain were coming from America, and they were not domestic. Now, Egmont was instrumental in encouraging Duchesne, sending him samples of Chinese porcelain to copy. And Duchesne also, at this point, asked for a patent for his product, but he never seems to have produced a final product, and he was never awarded that patent. But to even get to this level, one had to assume he actually had produced something that was on the verge of being true porcelain, if not actually producing it. So the story, though, of Duchesne in Savannah is frustrating. Although he's giving, well, this is serious. Although he is given money and encouragement by the trustees, he's constantly complaining and making excuses for his lack of success with the porcelain body. He becomes a malcontent who complains about the way the trustees are managing the colony. He's just a thorn in everybody's side. One writer suggests that Duché has become a little too much addicted to politics, and that as a result, his porcelain pursuits have suffered. So in spite of all the rhetoric, the hype, the materials, and the funding provided for the trustees, we have yet no physical evidence of Duché's Savannah porcelain. Personally, I feel there's no question that Duché was on the right track. And I think he was better on the right track. But at the very least, he brought clear attention to the Kaolin and the Cherokee lands to others who would pursue porcelain makers. And this is a strange bowl in the archaeological collections in Charleston. Maybe one day we'll talk about this piece, but not today. So everybody was really excited about the discovery of kaolin. But by the 1740s, the Cherokees weren't happy with the white men digging holes in their lands. But Duché continued to exploit the Cherokee mines through agents he had developed in his business as an Indian trader. By 1742, Duché was also in hot water with the trustees. He was owing them money and promised porcelain, and he made several unsuccessful attempts to escape Georgia without permission. On one occasion, he was caught sneaking away out of Savannah on a small boat loaded with diverse chests, casks, and other effects. Now, why he would need casks to get out of Georgia, I don't know. But in 1743, he ultimately was able to leave Georgia. And one of the trustees recorded that Duché has given us the slip. He stops in Norfolk, Virginia first, and from there he takes the first boat to London. And while in London, he goes to see his old friend, his supporter, the Earl Egmont, and delivers a long letter to the trustees rehashing his complaints and political entanglement. So he was there, reading them the riot act. But mysteriously, he has taken along samples of earthenware, so in quotes, of earthenware. Now, at this point, Duché spends at least 4 months in England, and this is coinciding with a British patent that was filed in 1744 for the production of porcelain from an earth, the product of the Cherokee Nation in America called Unica. So this is fairly conclusive evidence that when Duché's, his mysterious crates he was taken to London to contain the Cherokee clay, and that British ceramicists took full advantage of that where they filed their portent here. And this is the fledgling years of the Bow Factory. Most of us have heard about the Bow Factory in London. The patent is filed by Edward Halen and Thomas Fry. This is an image of Thomas Fry, who himself was not a potter, but he was a painter and an engraver, but a man of learning, and he certainly was hooked up with the scientific community. There's about 40 examples of this earliest known group of English porcelain, and recent scientific analysis has suggested this group is indeed made with ingredients from the Cherokee Unica. Now, the British ceramic community are not the first people to jump up and down and say, our English porcelains are based on using American clays. But that's not the case. And point that out every chance you get when you're speaking with your British colleagues. So, a little later, in May 1745, the British potter William Cookworthy had been visited by, quote, the person who hath discovered the China earth, unquote. So Duché is not mentioned by name, but this visitor had several examples of China ware of his own making, which he thinks were equal to the Asiatic or the Chinese style. And according to Cookworthy's letter, this person had discovered both the pitance, which is a feldspar, and kaolin in the back of Virginia, and that this kaolin is the essential thing towards the success of manufacture. In all likelihood, this person has to be Duché. A lot of people debate this. I don't. Who else was escaped from Savannah bringing a chest of clay and fired pottery to show off? Now, the important thing about this, a few years later, Cookworthy himself goes to discover China clay in Cornwall, the same clay I mentioned that Wedgwood took advantage of. So when kaolin was found in England, Cookworthy was the first English potter who devised a method of making hard paste porcelain. and that becomes the Plymouth and Bristol factories, which we have heard. So one could suggest that Duchay's secrets he shared with Cookworthy in 1740s came to fruition when the kaolin clay became available in England. Now, Duchay goes back home in 1745 to America. He returns to Charleston, where he continues the Indian trade in the Cherokee Territory, but he ultimately leaves and moves to Norfolk, where he works as a merchant for at least 15 years. But during this 15-year period, there's these mysterious shipments of Cherokee clay that continue to be made to England by various individuals other than Duchay. And one I want to highlight is this Henry Laurens, who many of you may know. He was the wealthiest man in the South, but also instrumental in the American Revolution. He was a merchant and planter and became interested in the Cherokee clay in the 1750s. It's noted that Laurens sent Thomas Mears to Liverpool 300 pounds of the Cherokee clay in 1757. In the mid-1760s, Charleston becomes a hotbed of porcelain activity. The master potter, Staffordshire potter John Bartlam, arrives in the settlement of Cane Hoy, just north of Charleston. Working both in Cane Hoy and Charleston, this is a recent story many of you should know by now. Bartlam is known to have produced Staffordshire-style earthenwares, and most importantly, a soft paste porcelain, which is now thought to be the earliest evidence of such a product in America. Now, as we mentioned, soft paste is different than hard paste, but this is appears to be the first successful attempt on American soil to produce even the soft paste. Now, the better known story of American soft paste porcelain manufacture begins in 1770 with the opening of the American China manufactory in Philadelphia by Goose Bonin and George Anthony Morris. That subject has been studied by a number of scholars, several in this room in particular. And Graham Hood is credited with the archaeological excavations of the factory site in the late 1960s and the publications of that. The history of the factory is well known, or best known through documents, archaeology, and most importantly, there's 20 surviving objects that we know from the Bonin and Morris factory. Now, these are above ground objects. These are the ones that sit in museums' shelves that we get to look at. We know historically that the Philadelphia factory relied upon master potters solicited from the Bow Porcelain Factory of London. So the technology and know-how to produce this porcelain using American setting and American clays was imported from the Bow factory. The type of porcelain made in Philadelphia, the soft paste porcelain, is not dissimilar from the recipe used in Charleston. Compositional analysis by my colleague Victor Owen has proved that the Bartlam, Bonin and Morris, and the Bow porcelain clay is consistent. They all have a very similar phosphatic soft paste porcelain. And during the 1750s and 60s, everyone in England is experimenting with soft paste porcelain. This is like the early years, perhaps, of the microcomputer in the early 80s, where every company in California has a little different take on it. Everyone was experimenting with these soft paste formulas. And you can see that there's quite a few, and the diversity is unbelievable. Now, what is phosphatic soft paste porcelain? One of the major components of the paste is ground animal bones, large animal bones that have been burned, calcined, and ground up into a fine powder. And this is not just a little sprinkling. This could compose a fair amount of the paste. So really, these animal bones are in high demand. Bonin and Morris were advertising for these huge quantities of animal bone. Cattle bone was the preferred, but horse bone would also work. But again, they were paying 20 shillings per 1,000 bones, I guess, not pounds. But the point is, they needed a lot of this animal bone as part of the manufacture. And most people don't even consider that when they're looking at these delicate porcelains behind the glass case, that this was quite a gruesome undertaking, but necessary to create the porcelain. Now, the Philadelphia factory clearly had a success with this soft paste porcelain, but again, at sometime in 1772, they changed that formula And they stopped asking for animal bones, and they started asking for large quantities of broken flint glass. Now, flint glass was a lidded glass could be ground up to fine powder and put in with the clays as well to create also translucency and reduce the firing. Is a different formula, but Bond and Morris really jumped horses entirely, and we don't know why. But the problem is, this basket shown here is the only known example from the factory that we know that has this glassy frit formula, which is amazing. And no archaeological specimens have been found. So even though we have this long trail of documentary evidence, we only have one object to talk about glassy frit. And I'll use that in a minute as an analogy. Now, finally getting to where we want to be, in 2014, archaeologists from the Commonwealth Heritage Group began large-scale excavations in the center of historic Philadelphia in advance of the construction for the new Museum of the American Revolution, shown here, which will be opening this spring in April. And here's this is the actual picture. It's not
That's a rendering.
a rendering,
Yeah.
but
It looks just like that.
yeah, it looks even better than this, yeah. But it's going to be it's a major addition to the story of the American Revolution opening in Philadelphia. It's bound to be a great boon for all of us interested in history and objects related to that history. The historic location of where the museum is located is down at 2nd and Walnut, and you can see the small blue box there. Here's a little better detail showing it really took up half the block there, the footprint of the building. And it had already been previously developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so much of the archaeological deposit had been destroyed by this modern construction. But there were a number of privy shafts on the property. These privy shafts, of course, were used as the outhouses in the 18th and 19th century, but they also became repositories for household trash that was thrown away. So they had these time capsules throughout the property, representing the early 18th century, well into the 19th century. And from this project, over 85,000 artifacts were retrieved. And it's probably the most remarkable assemblage of nearly intact 18th century ceramic vessels I have seen anywhere at any time. It's a huge resource. Of interest to us today was feature 16. Remember that, feature 16. It'll go down in history. This was a privy associated on a property that in the 18th century was once owned by a Humphreys family. Most of the objects were associated with a tavern that the operated by the Humphreys, either legally or illegally, depending on how we look at this. And most of this dates to the 1770s or maybe early 1780s. And the privy itself, we know, was sealed in 1789. So that just cuts off the time frame there. In total, from this privy, 326 ceramic vessels were found. They are dominated by English slipwares, English creamwares, and Chinese export porcelain. But out of the 326 ceramics, 1/3 of these objects are Philadelphia made. They're Philadelphia made lid glaze wares that are mimicking the popular creamwares of the period. So already we're predestined a little bit. There's a lot of domestically made ceramics within this feature 16. The museum is very proud of the recovery of the spectacular Liverpool punch bowl, a ship captain's bowl of the Tryphena, which is a remarkable artifact to see, not only as an artifact, but as a historic object. And they were so proud of it that the museum commissioned ceramic artist Michelle Erickson to create several replicas to give to their donors and their board members, which is a pretty smart thing to do if you guys are looking to give something that just doesn't come off the shelf down the street here. So it was doing a trip to the archaeological laboratory of the Commonwealth Heritage Group that I went along with Michelle to deliver the finished bowls. And that time I was able to spend some time with the lab's curator, Juliette Gerhardt, who kindly showed me all these ceramic treasures that had come from the site. Tucked away on a shelf on its own was this small white bowl. It caught my attention for several reasons, and when I asked Juliet what it was, she said she was puzzled by it also, and kind of sort of thought it was some sort of stoneware, perhaps related to English white salt glaze. And a lot of other people had kind of felt the same thing. Anyway, she had never seen anything quite like the paste before. We spent some time discussing the possibilities in our group. But at this time, I had some suspicions that we were looking at a porcelain body of some sort, not a stoneware body. And my first attempts to hold it up to the light to see if it was translucent failed miserably. It was just too bright in the lab. And I said, well, if it's not translucent, maybe not. But the curators from the museum were very supportive of me finding out more. So I called my friend, geologist Victor Owen in Newfoundland, who teaches at St. Mary's College. Victor has made a career in the last 20 years of applying geological analyses to a variety of historic English and American porcelains. As he likes to say, porcelains are nothing more than artificial rocks. And Victor was thrilled to participate, and he said, please send a sample up. I was a little worried, how am I going to get a sample down here? Because if I have to go through the routine of getting a small porcelain saw and it may take some time and effort. Victor just said, well, get a pair of pliers and just snip off a little bit. So for the record, that's what I did. And it's a small, very small thing, about the size of the pea. And Victor received this small sample. Now, Victor uses several techniques in his analyses, and he's best speaking on that himself. But the primary instrument is the scanning electron microscope shown here. I don't know if a few days before Christmas a year ago, I received this email from Victor, and the highlights are shown here. He says, the paste is silicious aluminum composition, which equates to a kaolin body. The glaze has the same composition. It is not a lead glaze. Two types of wares can have this, either a true hard paste porcelain or a fine earthenware. And it's not a fine earthenware. He says, without doubt, your sample has a thin, silicious, aluminous, calcic, alkaline, lid-free, high-temperature glaze that is not a phosphatic formula like Bond and Martis was using. Unprompted, Victor asked this, totally unprompted, is there any reason to believe that bowl was made in the U.S.? The second one, any possible connection with Duché, who I believe met Cooksworthy. So that was quite a Christmas present for me to receive that email. This photograph taken in this raking light shows that the bowl has many imperfections. It has bloated areas, it has voids, it has trimming marks, not usually associated with the finished porcelain products of the 1770s. Chinese, European, and otherwise. You barely see a hint or sheen of glaze on it, and the bowl's upstairs. And most people say it doesn't have a glaze, but it does. And Victor's able to prove that with this very thin line. I mean, he's able to analyze the composition of the glaze. But he suggests too that using the analytic techniques, the glaze never reached the temperature it was supposed to, which is at 1400 centigrade. He said it more likely seems to have been fired to a soft paste temperature, about 1200 degrees, and as a result, the glaze has crystallized, giving it sort of that matte sheen. He said in looking at thousands and thousands of fragments in his lifetime, he has only seen this phenomena a handful of times. So that was very interesting. His study of the paste of the bowl suggests that the ingredients were very poorly mixed, which suggests not a very good understanding, perhaps, of the technique of the materials of the time. And you can see this large blowout on the bottom of the bowl as though the materials exploded doing firing because they were not mixed properly. I was able to share this bowl with several distinguished colleagues to sort of gauge their opinions as well. And I was thrilled to have Graham Hood, who took great delight in the possibilities that an American-made product, and more importantly, we could directly associate it with the hand of Anthony Duché. So Graham was thrilled. And I can say there was no greater thrill than when I actually got back and was able to use a high-powered light, was to see that the bowl indeed was translucent. Our friend Scott Nolly conserved the bowl carefully, glued it back together using state-of-the-art standards, which is great for the museum and everyone else looking at the bowl now. Now, up to this point, things were looking pretty convincing that the bowl was not from any of the well-known 18th century porcelain sources. I could not say it was Chinese porcelain or a Germanic porcelain or a soft-paste English porcelain or even the product that was of the hard-paste porcelain of Plymouth in Bristol. And this is the earliest dated known example of Bristol porcelain, 1768, which again is nearly in the exact same time frame we're talking about here. But visually and analytically, I could not make that connection that this bowl was an English cook-worthy bowl. And again, if you're familiar with the two, I think looking here, you can see something different. We kept coming back to the known factory of Bonnet and Morris operating in Philadelphia between 1770 and 72. In addition to this 20 surviving example I've shown you, archaeologists are continually finding Bonnet and Morris products in these privies. They're being used by the consumers, broken and thrown away. This particular Bonnet and Morris bowl is the standard soft paste, phosphatic paste. And it's nice to actually have it marked with the P here, so there's no question that's a Bonnet and Morris product. But all these things we find in the ground tend to have these firing flaws in it, as though the seconds coming out of the factory were being sold off and used. So they all have these incredible firing flaws, which you don't expect to find necessarily, but they're there. And it suggests that Bonnet and Morris was having difficulty as well. And here's our bowl here, again with plenty of firing flaws as well. Now, how do we connect the maker of, how do we begin to understand who made this bowl? We know it's found in Philadelphia. We know it's found in a time period that Bonnet and Morris were working. We have this one particular letter here written by Henry Lawrence, our friend down in Charleston, who was a big shipper of Cherokee clay in the 50s and 60s. He puts a keg of clay in with his own two hands and delivers that to Mr. George Morris, the manager of the Bonnet and Morris factory. He's shipping up a cask of Cherokee clay in 1771. 6 months later, Bonnet and Morris takes out a newspaper ad that the proprietors of the China factory have lately made experiments with some clay presented to them by a gentleman of Charleston of South Carolina. So we have evidence the clay is coming to Philadelphia, and we have a statement that Bonnet and Morris indeed were experimenting with the Cherokee clay. The important thing here is they said it produces china superior to any brought from the East Indies, and will stand the heat beyond any kind of crucibles yet made. This also suggests immediately this is not a soft paste formula, but it's being able to be fired to the true porcelain temperature and equates to the Chinese porcelain of the period. So this begs the question, who actually in America was familiar with the making of hard paste porcelain during this time? I harken back to our friend Andrew Duché of Philadelphia, the first man in Europe, Africa, or America that has found the true material and manner of making porcelain. Duché's role in the Bonnet and Morris enterprise has always been a subject of speculation. But researchers have noticed in particular the timing of his move to Philadelphia in 1769. Remember, we left the story, he had been in England, he had come back, he had moved to Norfolk. In the early 1760s, he disappears again to England for about 6 years. He comes back to Norfolk and immediately moves to Philadelphia, just several months before Bonnet and Morris opens. Unfortunately, we have no other evidence than this sort of circumstantial evidence, but it has to be more coincidence that he was now placed in the middle of this intellectual and geographic proximity to the venture of Bonnet and Morris. So just how close was Duché to this? this blue dot here shows, here's the project area we're talking about. This shows the location of the warehouse that Bond and Mars kept in the city to sell the products of Bond and Mars pottery. The actual factory site is way about a mile, 3/4 of a mile down here to south of this, but they have an in-town pottery shop here to sell their goods. When Duché moves back to Philadelphia, he appears to open his own merchant operation on Market Street, right here. So he's within 100 yards of this other Bond and Mars enterprise. And he is personally living on 3rd Street, right here. So one could just see, one could easily make a connection that he's certainly in the right place at the right time to be aware and contribute to any experimentation, perhaps, with this Cherokee clay. Of course, it would be nice to find a letter, an account, or other document that connects him clearly to this, but I submit that Duché's invisible hands are all over this bowl. When the bowl was first cataloged as a probable English white salt glaze stoneware, it corresponded identically to the 1771 observation made in Georgia. William Stephens said he watched Duché turn some useful cups about the size of large teacups, and their present appearance differs little, if any, from some of our finest earthenware made in England, which was white salt glaze stoneware of the time. So he's saying Duché's products look like English white salt glaze stoneware. The lack of decoration on the bowl has caused some commentary. It may reflect the experimental nature of the object, but it also corresponds directly with another of Stephens' comment. Duché himself admitted that glazing and coloring is a peculiar work to be done by other hands who are artists in their own way. In other words, Duché himself could care less about the glazing and the decorating. He was interested in creating the paste. So if Duché was not making, if he was making undecorated porcelain in Savannah, you would think that may have occurred if indeed he was trying it again in Philadelphia in the early 1760s. Some have suggested that perhaps a workman for William Cookworthy's may have come over and been involved. We know there is a connection. After all, Duché met himself the Cookworthy in 1745 to show him the Cherokee clay and his results. And Duché just happened to be back in England in the 1760s, just at the very time Cookworthy was working on his own version of soft paste porcelain. On the left here is a recently excavated Bond and Mars sauce boat, one of a pair found in Philadelphia. On the right is an antique example of Cookworthy hard paste porcelain soft boat. This form is unique to Plymouth. So that suggests that either someone brought a mold or a sample of Cookworthy to America, to Bond and Mars. And I speculate that even Cookworthy may have given his old friend, Andrew Duché, either a model or a mold to use back in America. So very circumstantial, but again, that connection is something I argue for. Some have asked, why is this an important accomplishment at all? But clearly, based on the number of people in the room today, not many of you are among those, but why did this bowl end up in a privy? If it was so important, why did this bowl end up in the privy, along with hundreds of other tavern dishes? Perhaps to Philadelphia consumers, the cachet of this accomplishment didn't mean much. But we know, in fact, that many experimental wares were simply sold as affordable seconds. The desirability of seconds hold true for all 18th century porcelain factories. Back in England, Mr. Cookworthy was astounded that all his imperfect ware was selling like hotcakes coming out of the kiln. People were just buying everything, every scrap that came out of these kilns, regardless of how well they were finished. The selling of seconds must have been a big part of Bond and Mars factory enterprise. Earlier this year, we received an email from a young Philadelphia couple who were renovating a building, their own building in town. On their lot, they had found 3 privies. They had been approached by one of these creatures of the night that prowl at night. They're looking for construction sites to dig these privies for personal gain. and they really find some magnificent objects, but unfortunately, most of those are not shared with the academic community. Anyways, the minute they start the construction, this guy shows up and says, "Can I dig your privy?" And fortunately, they were smart enough to know that probably wasn't the best thing for the preservation of their historical property. So they, on their own, went out and learned how to do archaeology through reading, observation, and visiting. And they excavated their own privies in a manner that rivals any professional archaeologists have ever seen. And in the process, they found three Bana de Morris pieces of porcelain in this privy, which otherwise would have never been seen the light of day. In fact, the decoration on the sauce on the left we have never recorded before. This is Melissa and Matt Dunphy of Philadelphia, wonderful young couple. You can see the P on the punch bowl on the right here. Now, the most important part of those things is this small fragment on the left. You can see this is what Bana and Morris made their tea bowls. They called it the quilted pattern. And you can see how it matches a fragment Graham Hood recovered from the factory site. This has no glaze on it whatsoever. One would classify that as a factory waster, or not even a second. It's just a totally unfired, unglazed fired. And one would associate that to find in a waster contact at the factory. So how did that end up in the Dunphy's privy? And here's a bow example, so you can see the connection to bow here. As I mentioned, the Bana and Morris factory site is way down here in the southern part of Philadelphia. The Dunphys live up here on Callow Hill, down by the waterfront here. So there's no way a waster might have carried away by wind or erosion or to fall in their privy, even though some people have been not speculate, they've been critical about the leap of faith, how that piece got here. The answer is, one of the answers is that the property owned by the Dunphys here was owned by Philadelphia merchant Daniel Williams, who was a fairly prominent merchant in Williamsburg. He maintained a store right here down the alley from Bana and Morris's warehouse, and it's clear that he was carrying some of these products himself, or out of curiosity, or for some reason, these wasters were being consumed by the Philadelphia merchants. So that it's clear that from his store to his house, he had brought these objects. Again, which helps saying experimental wares and even wasters were being distributed through a purposeful action. Now, I'm going to try to summarize where we are. We know that from Victor's analysis, we know the bowl is an experimental example of hard-paste porcelain. That much we know. Unless somebody tells me different, it's unlike any Chinese, English, or German porcelain we have seen. We know from the documents, Bana and Morris, or someone in Bana and Morris is experimenting with Cherokee clay. We know that Andrew Duché is known for his porcelain experimentation in the 1740s, moves to Philadelphia, coinciding with the exact opening of the Bana and Morris factory. Duché also has a connection with William Cookworthy in England, who's making hard-paste porcelain. And the sauce boat of his type at the factory also suggests theirs. And the fact that factory seconds are routinely found in archaeological deposits suggests that this experimental bowl was just discarded or sold to be used. What we need to do to continue this, we need more analysis of the clay body to actually identify the source as a Western North Carolina thing. That is underway with some elemental analysis we are doing. We have to connect Andrew Duché to Bana and Morris with other evidence. We have to find a document, a letter, a newspaper account somehow. I'm going to leave that up to you Philadelphia people to have come. And we have to find more than one example of hard paste in Philadelphia. Everybody said, well, how can you tell that from one bowl? And well, that's all we have, but again, if you remember the glassy frit basket, we only have one example of that, and that does match up with the glassy frit. So you can learn something from one example. I should mention, just for the fun of it, there are other porcelains found in the same feature, including these two teapots. Initially, we both assumed these were English porcelain products. But I worked on having these conserved and also got out my trusty pliers and sent Victor a sample. The very preliminary results suggest that the example on the right is a Liverpool soft paste porcelain. However, the example on the right was found to be a true hard paste porcelain, which has a lid glaze. That suggests the body, again, is made of this kaolin material. It was fired to bisque, decorated in blue, then put a lid glaze on. I think the English call this some sort of hybrid porcelain, but as a possibility, this is, and oops, when I show this to my English colleagues, I have yet to get a definite answer that this is a English, possibly Liverpool object. So stay tuned. And if turns this could be something cool, but I didn't have. We'll see. So, yeah, well. So as part of this exercise, we've written 2 full-length articles published in Ceramics in America 2016, which we have advanced copies at Jeff Evans upstairs for sale. I also made a big use of social media to share these findings and theories. For the most part, the Facebook audience were supportive, but I've never had so much nasty feedback from people all over the world saying, how can you make this assumption based on it? I mean, it was unbelievable. You know, like it's not like a political thing. It's just a little white ball. But one reason I made a big effort to share it and even create this publicity I've tried to do is that hundreds of thousands of ceramic fragments have come from Philadelphia excavations over the years. And the more people we make aware of this, the more chance we may learn something. So, you know, I mean, it's hard to make a definitive statement based on a single artifact. I got a message on Facebook last Friday from my colleague, Debbie Miller. Debbie has a long association with the Philadelphia collections at the National Park Service, both as an employee and a contract consultant with them now. She was in the Franklin Court buildings working on this exhibit, which has been up for 30 years. And if you note here in the foreground here, she sent me this image of the small porcelain tea bowl excavated nearby. This was excavated within 100 yards of the bowl we just mentioned. It was labeled English porcelain 1754 to 1758, I think, and it had been exhibited in plain sight for 30 years. A close look at this bowl shows a number of extreme firing flaws and a very strange glaze. It comes from a solid 18th century context, and again, within 100 yards of where the Humphreys punch bowl was found. And you can see these amazing flaws in the glaze here. Now, at this point, I'm just looking at a photograph, but based on the sort of the shape, the firing, the trimming marks, you can see linear trimming marks here. I have never seen any English porcelain with this type of glaze flaws to that degree, and it certainly doesn't look like the phosphatic Bonnet de Mars glaze. I'm suggesting maybe we do indeed have a second piece that has appeared in plain sight. So I'm headed to Philadelphia Monday for a number of reasons, but I'm taking along a pair of pliers to to see if we can find a sample of this. So that, to me, this literally happened just Friday while I'm sitting at the computer trying to write this. And I said, don't send me that because it's going to mess my whole thing. But anyway, it's very exciting, so we have to stay tuned. And this is ongoing work. So clearly, I've covered a lot of ground, and I encourage you to read the articles and look at the bowl. But again, back to the question, why is the search for true porcelain production in America so important? There have been numerous books that have devoted to the topic of creating porcelain in the Western world, and all three of these are wonderful reads. On the most recent publication, The White Road by Edmund Duval, has come out. Edmund's an artist himself, so I give him a little liberty. He does mention the Cherokee clay in the events of Wedgwood experimenting with the clay. Nowhere in there does he mention the name Andrew Duché, and for that I don't forgive him. That's from The Godfather, right? Because Andrew Duché and his scientific exploits in America for at least over 30 years in the search for American is so important, and I think we all need to recognize the name and somehow as scholars, even as collectors, make that a much more visible aspect here. So Andrew Deshaies, certainly he was not the first man in Europe and Africa, but he may have been he was the first man in America, as far as I'm concerned, who discovered the true material manner of making porcelain. So that was a lot today. I didn't do this alone. I have a lot of people who help with this. It's an ongoing story, and we again, it's opening a new chapter, or at least shedding light on something. So again, thank you very much today. And I'm afraid to take questions, so yes.
First of all, thank you for a very, very interesting lecture, and perhaps I should, in all fairness, I should be asking this to Victor rather than to you.
Yes, you should.
One of my questions, you will do trace element analysis in kaolin to see the origin.
Right.
That's what I understand. The other one is, have you determined the flux? In other words, as you know, feldspar is one of the fluxes.
Yeah.
Have you determined that feldspar was used, which you can do by potassium?
Yes, we have feldspar and quartz.
Okay, so, all right. And have you detected malite crystals?
Yes.
You have?
Yes.
So that requires quite a bit of high temperature.
Yeah.
Well, but I have you had it.
Okay, and you'll enjoy reading Victor's article. So, good. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you reaching out to the bottle collecting community? Because frequently when they are out collecting bottles, they leave the shards of pottery in the bottoms of the hole as quote-unquote worthless material.
That's it.
And in South Jersey, Camden, I'm thinking, or Philadelphia, the bottle diggers may have pieces for you.
The short answer is yes. That's one reason for the social media pouring, is to make people aware of these things. It's for professional archaeology is a two-edged sword, because the bottle collectors and the privy diggers, of course, destroy important historical resources, mainly for their own gain. But there are some who like to share. And I'm walking a tightrope between my professional ethics and wanting to know these things. So the short answer is yes. And I welcome any knowledge. This is such an important subject. I'm not going to turn away any source of additional new knowledge for this. That's a good question. Good. Any other questions? Well, come see me, please. Have a look at the bowl. Again, thank you all so much.